Right. So good morning, everybody. This morning we welcome our visiting speaker, Dr. Wendy Godek. Thank you. And Wendy is a proud alum of the DGA program. She got a PhD, so she basically precedes you guys. And she's someone you could look at and say, well, that could be me in 5 years. And I hope that in 5 years I'm going to be sitting here and one of you is going to say, well, 5 years ago I was there and there was a previous DGA PhD student giving the talk, and this time it's me. So Wendy got a PhD from DGA about 5 years ago. She's currently an assistant professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Roger Williams University in Rhode Island, and she's also affiliated with the Public Health and Latin American departments. And prior to joining Roger Williams University, she lived in Nicaragua for 7 years. And in Nicaragua, she started off working as a consultant to several rural development organizations. And then she moved on to work as a researcher at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. And in those 4 years at that institute, she worked with the research program on integrated systems for the humid tropics, and then went on to become a gender specialist. And her talk today is going to reflect those experiences and her research agenda in this field. So we welcome you, Wendy, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back at Rutgers. I was commenting to Dr. Kuting, I'm sure she remembers quite clearly, that 5 years ago today, at exactly about this time, in this very room, I defended my dissertation. And that was the last time I was here, in this 4th floor of the Dana Library. But it's always been one of my favorite venues on campus. And for those of you, when you defend, I highly suggest it. And there's also another room over on the other side that's very nice as well. Which was unavailable, but that was fine. So the title of my talk today, as you can see, is Confronting Climate Change in Agricultural Development, Small Farmers, and the Gender Decision-Making Nexus. So this kind of gives away some of the key ideas that I'll be talking about, but essentially what I'm going to try to do is connect together an argument and develop it that decision-making in micro-contexts, specifically household decision-making among small farm families, is helpful for understanding gender relations and agricultural decision-making practices, and this information in turn is useful for tackling the dual challenges of addressing climate change and deepening gender equality. So essentially I'm talking about 2 different questions here. One is, what can we learn about gender relations and adoption of agricultural practices from studying household decision-making? And then, how is this information useful for tackling the dual challenges of climate change and gender inequality? So just a little background, as Dr. Kuting was saying, I began working on this topic while I was a researcher at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture in Managua, Nicaragua. The International Center for Tropical Agriculture is also known by its acronym. We call it CIAT, and CIAT's headquarters are in Cali, Colombia. So for about the last 18 months, I was working as part of the gender team, which is based in Cali, but I was the gender specialist in the Managua office. And this research study on household decision-making about agricultural practices was proposed by the leader of the gender research agenda for CIAT, named Jennifer Twyman. She's a protege of a pretty well-known feminist economist who works on rural and agricultural development in Latin America named Carmen Deere. She has pretty interesting work. And essentially, myself and another colleague of mine, Maria Alejandra Garcia, we designed this study based on the proposal that Jen gave us. And so we presented some of our findings in a paper last year at the Latin American Studies Association conference, and then this talk basically builds on some of the arguments that we made in this paper, and then fleshes them out a bit more and provides some additional perspective. So before we get into the topic of household decision-making, I'd like to provide a little bit of background on the linkages between climate change, gender, and agriculture. Talk a little bit more about the particular situation of small farmers in developing countries, and specifically rural women. So while feminist scholars have stressed the link between gender and climate change for some time, the global climate change community didn't really begin to formally recognize the implications of climate change for gender until the 2010 Conference of the Parties in Cancun. So at this time, what we saw was a deepening for the call of participation of women that had existed at that point, but definitely intensified. And also, members of the Conference of the Parties were encouraged to introduce policies and language to take gender equality and women's empowerment into account when designing and implementing climate change interventions. So this kind of mainstreaming of gender into the climate change discourse is increasingly evident in the development strategies and publications of various international and non-government organizations, donors, and research institutes working on the topic. And here you can just see just a few of the many publications that have come out on the topic of gender and climate change in international development. So you'll see some from, this is from the United Nations, this is from the Conference on Climate Change. This is from the CGIAR, which is, CIAT is part of the consultative group on international agricultural research. It's one of 15 institutes that make up the CGIAR. So they have a research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security that the study I did was also kind of, we worked with them on a little bit. UNDP, I mean, there's a whole range of international institutions, as well as non-government organizations. CARE is one of the big international non-government organizations working on gender and climate change, for example. So essentially, all this mainstreaming has created some good news because there's been some progress in visibilizing women in climate change and their unique needs. But the issue of gender inequality has not figured so prominently in this, in the developments. And in particular, as political ecologist Wendy Godek points out, there's a need for three areas of focus. There need to be more nuanced gender analysis of the impacts of climate change, meaning how it affects men and women, a deeper consideration of gender differences in climate change adaptation and mitigation measures, and the enhanced understanding of how gender inequality could affect the vulnerability of different groups to climate change. So, as Gonda and other feminist scholars explain, there's several reasons for the lack of attention paid to these gender dimensions of climate change. One of the most important of these is the characterization of climate change, of the climate change discourse as being masculine. So some of the reasons for this, or I should state that one of the most important reasons for this, given the lack of gender parity in the climate change area, women's voices may be growing as they're becoming more represented, but they don't equal those of men. So there's not necessarily equal participation. And from an investigative, meaning research standpoint, this has significant implications into how we inquire about or scholarly work and research on climate change. Another scholar who wrote a book in 2016 on the subject of gender and climate change speaks in detail about this point concerning the masculinization of climate change discourse, and she explains that climate change research to date has mainly focused on mapping the geophysical contours of climate change rather than social and economic dimensions, consequences, and drivers. And she argues that these geophysical studies have largely relied on positivist methods of scientific inquiry, such as mathematical modeling, remote sensors, and over different methods that would rely more on human experience. And these methods that rely on human experiences are often perceived as less rigorous and less objective. The results of these positivist studies have largely framed climate change as a threat to human security for which technical solutions must be applied that aim to combat climate change. And we see this also in military discourses and security discourses about climate change. Furthermore, Nagel explains that when social and economic dimensions of climate change have been considered, or these human dimensions of climate change, they've often generalized the causes and consequences of climate change to humanity as a whole, rather than applying gendered, racial, generational, or class-based analyses to really look at who's being affected and why. The consequences of this discourse, Nagel argues, is also evident in the technical solutions to climate change dilemmas. For example, the carbon offsetting mechanism in the UN's Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation program, which often disproportionately affects vulnerable populations like small farmers, women, and indigenous peoples, whose livelihoods depend on natural resources. Broadly speaking, when women have been considered in analyses, they are often framed as this homogeneous group of victims of climate change, rather than active agents with the capacity to take actions to mitigate or adapt to climate change. An example of this is the lack of visibility of indigenous women and their knowledge and use of promising climate-responsive agricultural practices in climate change discourses. Basically, they're hidden, even though there are many feminist researchers that are trying to make them more visible in the discourse. But really, at the macro level, we don't see them to the extent that they actually exist. From a development standpoint, 2 additional reasons for the absence of research and interventions to tackle the question of gender inequality identified by Gonda include confusion between the use of the words women and gender, which are often used synonymously but are not synonyms, and that international organizations and non-government organizations working on climate change have focused more on interventions and actions to address the geophysical impacts of climate change and not the social effects, a point which is consistent with the dominance of the masculinized discourse. On the other hand, feminist organizations have not adequately integrated climate change into their social justice work, and part of the reason for this may be their more limited participation in shaping climate change discourses at the macro level. So, tackling the issue of gender and climate change is critical, and especially for small farm families that are already the most vulnerable to agricultural shocks, like natural disasters or market fluctuations. And this is particularly true for small farm families living in poor countries, as many of these countries have been identified as being the most vulnerable to climate change and among the least prepared to deal with it. So let's briefly look at some of the data on anticipated climate change impacts on agriculture and poor countries, and then we'll turn to what this implies for rural women who make up about 43% of the agricultural workforce in developing countries. So this is, I chose several, I think I have about 3 different graphics to sort of illustrate what's happening. There is lots of data out there. This graphic is what the FAO calls the cascading effects of climate change on agricultural systems and food security. So it starts with climate change and some of the geophysical effects of climate change and how that then goes to affect agroecosystems. It creates new kinds of, the way we pests and diseases will change in response to these sort of geophysical drivers. That will affect the way that we're actually cultivating and where we can cultivate, how we can cultivate, species we're cultivating and their relationship. We see extreme events, increases in productive capital as more inputs or different inputs are needed, and then of course knowledge to determine what this all means, which is not really in the graphic quite as such. And then this goes down to affect agricultural production and post-harvest. It will affect the consumption of food by farmers, the food that they're growing, but will also affect what they're funneling into markets, and then ultimately affecting the incomes of folks who rely on agriculture for their livelihoods, but also consumers who are buying what these folks are growing. And then it funnels down into food security and nutrition, meaning whether or not we have availability and access to food in a stable way, and that it is safe food and we can consume and ingest it and biologically use it to sustain ourselves in a healthy way. What I will sort of mention here is, again, where this looks different depending on who you are. And agricultural livelihoods, farmers, fisher folks, pastoralists, and forest dwellers, that's a rather, it's not a homogeneous group of people. That looks very different depending on where you are. And you don't really see any sort of differentiation there on how it's affected, but this is very, very common in the discourse. The next, let's see. And I also wanted to point out here that climate change is already affecting agriculture. Between 2005 and 2015, the Food and Agriculture Organization estimated that 26% of all climate-related losses occurred in the agricultural sector. That's pretty significant already. So we won't really know what's happening now for a little while, but it's something that needs to be paid attention to. So I like this figure a lot because it illustrates kind of climate vulnerability and preparedness of countries to deal with climate change. So we can see that countries with larger circles and colored yellow, orange, or red are those that are the most vulnerable to climate change and are the least prepared. So you'll notice that most of these are in sub-Saharan Africa, but also parts of Asia, the Middle East, and South and Central America. And you'll notice that smaller green circles are for most of North America and Western Europe, and partially in Central, yeah, like Central and Eastern Europe as well. But definitely this area where you have concern about some of the island countries in the South Pacific, Asia, and then particularly in Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, Salvador to a certain extent, but these are areas that are well known to be affected by climate change. And then here as well. Although I did hear recently from one climate change specialist that they're expecting South America to become the new food production site during climate change. So I'm sort of interested in juxtaposing some of this against what she was saying. But let's go to this graph now. In this final graphic, we can see the anticipated changes in agricultural production and how it's interesting to consider this map with what we just saw as far as vulnerability and preparedness. Because what we'll see is the same areas that are vulnerable and are least prepared are also the places where we're anticipating the greatest changes and decreases in food production. So the picture, and the other thing I want to point out about this map that's very interesting is when it was created on the premise that this is the situation if farmers adapt the latest agricultural technology, which of course is a pretty intense premise to be making, because we very much know that whether or not farmers adapt agricultural technology has to do with a lot of factors, which include their ability to access that technology, whether economically, or actually access it in terms of it being available to them, or knowing about it and learning about it. So this is sort of a best case scenario, but of course it also doesn't take into consideration that farmers may not be interested in adopting these kinds of technologies. So there's a lot of assumptions here. And I also think it drives home this salient point that the climate change discourses tends to generalize impacts and consequences without adequately taking into account these social disparities. Now, finally, if we look at some estimates of the male-female agricultural labor force, we can see that some of the countries that are most vulnerable to climate change and the least prepared are located in regions where there's a substantial amount of female agricultural labor force. So if we look at sub-Saharan Africa and we begin to look at agriculture, a significant amount in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southern Asia, in Eastern and Southeast Asia, and developing countries as a whole is female. So, and women, generally produce food. So this is worrisome for a number of reasons, and mainly because women already face serious disadvantages in agriculture. Women in developing countries often do not have equal access to agricultural resources such as land, credit, fertilizers, seeds, or technical knowledge. They engage in unpaid labor like childcare and domestic work in addition to agricultural labor. There is a significant number of female-headed households, in particularly, I think it's around 25% or so in sub-Saharan Africa. And in addition, local laws and gender norms often inhibit their ability to own land or acquire other assets. They participate less in decision-making at the household and community levels. And as a result of these conditions, women's agricultural yields are normally lower than their male counterparts. So if we have a highly feminized, if labor is feminized and there's a growth in the number of women working in agriculture, but they have unequal circumstances in which they're trying to produce, they have a lot of factors against them. So these sorts of gender inequalities that already disproportionately affect women, especially rural women, who are among the most vulnerable, are expected to increase with climate change. And we're already seeing this phenomenon, for example, with weather and climate-related natural disasters, as data indicates that women are affected by and die more frequently from these disasters. And in other ways, they're affected too, because during recovery stages after disasters, women and children are often among the most vulnerable and go, for example, into sex trafficking or become enslaved. Other data has noted a rise in child marriage as a result of climate-related shocks that impact family food security. And as a result, adolescent girls are either willing or unwillingly leave their families to marry early. Another recent case is the migrant caravan to the United States. Climate change was one of the cited push factors that led families to make a decision to leave their communities in Central America and go towards the border. And there was a noted increase in the number of women and children from previous years, suggesting that there are new dynamics behind migration, and climate change is one of them. This is not good news. So, fortunately, while the situation facing rural women is expected to worsen with climate change, it's also provoked thinking within the international development community of how to both empower women and transform gender relations, and those are two different processes. Gender mainstreaming tools help development researchers and practitioners to better integrate gender into research studies and agricultural development projects according to their stated objectives. Furthermore, several tools and indices, such as the Women's Empowerment and Agriculture Index created by USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, and the International Food Policy Research Institute, and then there's another Women's Empowerment and Agriculture Index created by CARE as well, the non-government organization, were created to explore and document women's engagement in agriculture, as well as the constraints and limitations they face. So the idea is to use this knowledge as a baseline for assessing change, as well as to use it to design interventions to promote change. So a key component of these frameworks to measure empowerment is the extent to which women are involved in decision making. That's one of the indicators to measure their empowerment. And Naila Kabir, she's a prominent scholar on the subject of empowerment, and she defined empowerment as the processes by which those who have been denied the ability to make choices acquire such an ability. I'm going to repeat that again because it's really important. The processes by which those who have been denied the ability to make choices acquire that ability. She calls decision-making the observable element of empowerment, meaning we can actually see it and we can study it. Others have argued decision-making to be a measurement of gender transformative change or the deepening of gender equality. So in terms of decision-making and climate change, most of the focus has been on deepening women's participation at macro-level decision-making spaces, well, like the United Nations, for example, or the COP, or Conference of the Parties. But significant strides have been made. Climate change decision-making spaces are still predominantly occupied. Discusses some of the benefits of women's participation in decision-making. While acknowledging that it is unclear what the outcome of including more women in decision-making would be, she highlights data that suggests that women's involvement in decision-making is associated with more effective decisions and successful achievement of goals. And this has extended into the climate change-related issues like lowering carbon emissions. In some cases, she reports, these results have increased with greater gender parity, meaning when you have a greater balance of women and men making decisions, they do see some data that indicates that there's more effective decisions being made and they achieve outcomes in the long run. And another recent study at a very small level that was done by a colleague of mine on agroecology suggested that women might have different values than men do when it comes to different climate adoption strategies. And she was studying the adoption of agroecological practices, which are believed to foster more resilient agroecosystems to mitigate climate change. And what she found is that women generally adopted more of these practices than men did, and they believe that it might have to do with different values they have about the environment. So there is a nascent sort of literature on this that's emerging. But despite its importance, when it comes to decision-making at climate change at the micro level, even though Katerina's studies there is very little empirical work on what this means. And considering the arguments for enhanced decision-making effectiveness, it's interesting to think about the possible implications of climate change decision-making in micro-level contexts, like farms and households. So in other words, would enhancing women's participation in household and farm-level agricultural decisions lead to more effective responses, particularly in terms of adapting or mitigating climate change? And by adapting means to take different steps to be able to sort of adjust to the different circumstances that are created by climate change, whereas mitigating is really trying to slow down the whole process, if not halt it, by adopting different practices. For example, this is where agroecological practices come in because they're believed to not actually contribute to more climate change. So there's a debate over those two terms as well. Bless you. So, similar to macro context, the answer to the question of whether or not women's participation in household decision-making about agricultural decisions would, in fact, lead to more effective responses is not known, but studying this can tell us two things. They can reveal patterns in gender relations to help us better understand factors that influence the adoption of climate-friendly practices, and they may help us to assess changes in gender relations by climate change and variability. And I'll be talking about the first of those as I go forward, these patterns in gender relations that can help us to better understand these factors that influence the adoption. So, let me see. So studies of household decision-making by small farmers has grown in recent years parallel to this interest in identifying factors that have increased the empowerment of women and gender equality. So scholars have studied different elements of decision-making. They've studied bargaining power, resources, how resources affect how people make decisions. And through such studies, it's clear that decisions can be made in different ways. Households make decisions differently. Sometimes men and women make decisions on their own without consulting their spouse, and sometimes they make decisions with their spouse, and we call those joint decisions. And then sometimes they make decisions with the whole family involved, or a parent will consult a child, so there's different patterns. Most of the work that's been done on this has looked at decisions made or reported by the head of household or the male and female spouse, and slightly less on families. But it's clear that, that individuals don't always agree on who makes the decisions in the households. And this underscores the significance of perceptions for understanding decision making. Meaning, if you ask the wife who makes a decision about who feeds the pigs, and then you ask the husband who feeds the pigs, sometimes you get two different answers. So it goes to say that depending on who you talk to, they perceive the whole act differently. And this can help us to really understand where power relations lie. So studies have usually found that men report making agricultural decisions individually, and women report making these decisions either with their husbands or sometimes individually. So there's what we call spousal discord here. When there's spousal accord, it means they both agree they're making the same decision. When there's discord, it means that one says they're making a decision, the other one says the decision is being made differently. So essentially what it comes down to is that men and women have different perceptions of decision making, and there's a gap in knowledge about the kinds of perceptions they have about it, and particularly those related to power and how perceptions shape decision making practices. So joint decision making between husbands and wives, as I just said, is particularly valuable for understanding household gender relations and how these shape agricultural decisions. Joint decisions at their essence are a negotiation between spouses or other family members, and they can reveal patterns of bargaining power. They can also tell us about women's empowerment in terms of whether women have the ability to participate in these decisions, regardless of whether or not they choose to participate. So can a woman ask herself, can I make a decision about this if I want to? Or if I don't, I don't. But this is what we mean about this question of empowerment. And then finally, related to the last point, they can tell us about who's considered to be the legitimate decision maker. So why one would follow what the other one said. Do they have a certain legitimacy over the decision? So very few studies have actually sought to look at these kinds of questions. So there was a study conducted by a CIAT researcher named Mariola Costa, and she used mixed methods to look at decision-making perceptions among farm families in Uganda. And she found that men and women did not participate as equals in the decision-making process, which perhaps isn't so surprising. And in fact, men and women's perceptions of decision-making fell into 4 categories. And for each of these categories, men had the final say on the decision. And in fact, on only one category did women participate in the process in any sort of meaningful way to potentially influence the decision. So this is agricultural crop. And she basically said there's either a discussion about the joint decision or there's no discussion. So remember, these are perceptions of joint decisions. So it means they asked the woman, they asked the man, what does it mean to make a joint decision about an agricultural practice? And essentially, their responses fell into these 4 categories. They either reported that the man basically tells the woman after he made the decision that he made it, and man informs the decision to the woman before he makes a decision that I'm going to go do this, or there's a conversation between them, which means that maybe they talk about it, the man says, I'm going to go do this, and maybe the woman says, okay, and maybe gives some ideas, but he makes a decision not based on what she said at all, he just does what he wants to do. And then there's another category where women's ideas are considered, but the man has the final say ultimately. So essentially, we're seeing a real lack of power and a lot of gender inequality when it comes down to these kinds of decisions about agriculture. So given the lack of this research on gender relations and perceptions of decision making, a team of us undertook a study to look at what was happening in agriculture in Latin America. So this study, as I said, was originally proposed by Jennifer Twyman, and it was basically to do some follow-up research on a survey they did in 2 sites in Latin America, one in Cauca, Colombia, and another site in north-central Nicaragua called Tumaladalia. And essentially, both are located in climate-vulnerable areas. The study emerges from this gender survey that had been implemented in these sites in 2015. And basically, the survey component on household decision-making came up with the same patterns we've seen in almost every other study. Men say they make the decisions, women say, no, they're made jointly or I make them. But it didn't tell us much about couples' perceptions of the decision-making process because it's a survey. And surveys have a very limited ability, quantitative studies have, in general, a very limited ability of being able to capture any sort of real rich description on why people do what they do. Even though there have been some quantitative studies on perceptions, they're still pretty limited, and this is where mixed methods research really comes in to play with qualitative methods. So a mixed methods was conceived and consisted of a social choice experiment, which I'm not going to talk about too much, happy to address any questions, focus groups and semi-structured interviews with households led by female, male couples and single-headed households. What I'm going to talk about today is the data from just male-female households and not the single-headed households. We had, so essentially we analyzed qualitative data collected from semi-structured interviews with 18 couples in Colombia and 10 in Nicaragua. And we asked them what it meant to them to make a decision individually and jointly. We asked them about farm-related decision-making, meaning how decisions are made, by whom, and why. And we asked them about this process of making a joint decision with their spouse by basically saying, can you describe the decision you made with your spouse? We also asked them things like, do you belong to any organizations? Have you received any gender equality training or exposure to such ideas? What does machismo mean to you? We asked them, I think that's basic, those are the main questions we asked them, if they belong to organizations, gender equality, machismo, and if they were satisfied with the decisions that they were making, or they felt that they wanted to participate in decisions that they weren't making, were there decisions that they were making that they didn't want to make, did they want more help with some decisions that they were making, they didn't feel that they were very confident making them. So we asked them about those topics as well. So what did we find out about this? And this sort of goes to the first question that I posed in the beginning of the talk about why is this important for understanding agriculture? How does this help us to understand gender relations in households? And essentially we found out that men and women have similar ideas of what decision making means in theory. So we ask you, what does it mean to make an individual decision? What does it mean to make a joint decision? Individual decisions are made when one makes a decision without consulting their spouse. So that's basically the common definition that was given. Or when a decision is made without reaching an agreement, which was less prominent in the data. We found out that joint decisions are understood as reaching an agreement through dialogue. Gender dimensions were evident in the Nicaragua case, but not in the Colombia case. So men and women in Colombia and men in Nicaragua, they viewed individual decisions more so as a possible source of conflict. So if you didn't reach an agreement through a joint decision and you made a decision on your own, it could create conflict in your household. And joint decisions were seen as a way of maintaining harmonious relationships between folks in the household. But, and this was only the Nicaragua case, some women expressed that for them, individual decisions were empowering, that they felt really good about making them. So that was an interesting finding we made. Now, concerning perceptions of agricultural decision-making, on the whole, the households conform to traditional gender norms. and correspond to traditional gender division of labor. So women are at home, taking care of their children, taking care of the house, cooking, feeding people, and men are on the farm. So we didn't see that in pretty much every case it was like this. For both sites, agricultural decisions were made mostly by men individually, or to a lesser extent with their spouses. As such, we saw limited participation of women in making agricultural decisions, and when they do participated, they reported it as being through joint decisions. There were very few, if any, instances where women reported making agricultural decisions by themselves. So if they were involved, it was with their husbands, but their husbands made them on their own. The men and women from both sites identified several factors that influence who make decisions. So when we asked them, why do you make decisions about the household and he makes decisions about the farm, some of the comments had to do with gender norms. Well, that's his responsibility is the farm. That's where he is. The farm is his. I'm at home and I have to take care of the kids. I have to take care of the house. We also saw perceptions of technical knowledge. Why does he make decisions about fertilizers? Because he knows about it and I don't know about it. Ownership of land and assets, and this came up mainly in Colombia because in the Nicaragua case, none of the women were landowners. But in Colombia, because of the way land is inherited, it can be inherited while your family's still alive as well. So there were more female owners of land. So we saw a little bit more of women making decisions about their own land. And in Nicaragua, some women reported to be owners of small livestock, for example, that were close to the house. So they made decisions about their livestock. So we see, I wouldn't say it's super significant, but a relationship between the ownership of assets and decision making, which has come out in the literature as well, which wasn't so surprising. But we also saw that finally there were time restraints. Women reported not being involved in decision making because they had too much to do at home. Men reported they had too much to do on the farm to worry about making household decisions. So we see that there's a time dimension to this as well. Now, as far as spousal accord and discord in agricultural decision-making, women and men generally have similar perceptions of what decision-making means to them, but they don't agree on how they're made. Spousal accord, in Colombia, they were more likely to agree that men make decisions about adopting new agricultural practices, they make decisions about fertilizers, agrochemicals, inputs, hired labor, farm income, but women sometimes are involved in these decisions if she's affected by them or if she has some sort of knowledge to bring to the forefront about how to adopt a new practice because she went to a workshop and learned about it. So again, the legitimacy of knowledge, the legitimacy of who owns of the gender domains and ownership. In Nicaragua, spouses agree that men make decisions about agrochemicals and fertilizers. That was one of the only things that they agreed upon that men made the decisions about. There was very frequent spousal discord, disagreeing about who made the decision, but there was a very interesting finding here, and this was very significant because it contradicted all the quantitative data, which is that men report that they make agricultural decisions jointly with their spouse, but their spouse reported that the men make them individually. This contradicts the whole dynamic of the quantitative research that was done in these particular sites. And we found that the same pattern was true for farm-related activities in the female domain, it should be domestic-related activities in the female domain. Women reported that men helped them make decisions about the domestic domain, whereas the men said, no, she's making those decisions. So this comes down to the fact that perceptions matter. This matters. So the most frequent type of agricultural joint decision-making identified in the data from both sites was when women and men exchanged opinion. This is about joint decision-making. So when they're jointly making decisions, basically they report a joint decision as one being made where they're both exchanging opinions and make a decision together. So unlike the evidence that we saw from Uganda, there's definitely more conversation happening in these sites in Latin America. But there's different degrees of women's participation in the decision-making process, which suggests that women and men do not participate equally in the process of making joint decisions. In cases of joint decisions where women and men describe engaging in a thoughtful dialogue, emphasizing listening and analyzing together, what we found is that both men and women initiated decisions, not just men, number one. And it described the scenarios where there appeared to be more bargaining power between the two. But the other very important variable here is in these cases where we saw there to be much more signs of more equitable bargaining power, signs that women were initiating decision making, were also among couples that had received gender equality training. So people who did not receive gender equality training did not depict the same kinds of patterns or had some exposure. And this is some of the different types of decision making that we noted in Nicaragua and Colombia. We had more patterns than we saw. This one right here, men and women exchange opinions, make decisions together, was the most cited. I mean, and I'm not saying it was highly cited, but it was the most frequent we saw. Man considers the woman opinion makes the final decision was less frequent, and the man informs the woman before making the decision, and the woman conforms to what he said. Was actually, this came out quite a lot. And this scenario was like, I'm going to go plant these coffee plants today, what do you think? And she's like, está bien, it's fine. Like, there's no significant kind of negotiation involved. She just kind of goes along with what he's saying. And then this, the man makes the decision and there's no discussion. It happened in one case. It was very rare, and in that particular household, the woman reported only being involved in making about one decision that we asked about, which had to do with food preparation. She was very, there was a very, very machista power dynamics in that household that we saw. So when it came to women's preferences for agricultural decision making and their agency, we didn't really collect enough data on this to be confident in being able to raise any questions as to whether or not women and men were really satisfied with how they were making decisions. But we did see that some of the women who received gender equality training were more likely to express interest in saying they wanted to be more involved in decision making. Whereas the women who didn't receive gender equality training, there was only one case of one woman who said she wanted to be involved in making more decisions. And this kind of raised the question for me as to whether or not women were even aware that they could be involved in making more decisions because of the gender norms and the power of them to construct institutions. In both cases, men report that women made agricultural decisions with them jointly. And this suggested that men perceived women as having more agency than women perceived themselves as having. So that's a really interesting point right there that I think deserves some more analysis. And bringing this all together under the second question, and kind of this is my wrap-up slide to the presentation, is that what does this mean for tackling climate change and gender inequality? And what can all of this teach us about really looking at these questions? And it teaches us we have some challenges. Traditional norms concerning perceptions of agriculture as being men's domain. That's huge. It's shaping pretty much what's going on. One of the strongest driving factors. Women lack resources that might help them be more legitimate and give them more bargaining power in agricultural decision making and fostering their agency, mainly assets and knowledge. Women may not perceive themselves as having agency that in fact they're perceived to have. And increasing the reach of gender equality training. Like, that is a challenge. We need to do more of that. So the opportunities we have, and I didn't talk too much about this, but I did want to note it here, is that there's examples of progress on gender norms. In Colombia, people were commenting on the fact that they were questioning machismo more because they had received training on it, and they didn't want to be involved in making too many individual decisions because that's machista. That would be men dominating, and we want to give women. There was a recognition of women's importance in decision making by people who had been exposed to these ideas. And these ideas, I might say, aren't just from NGOs that are working on feminist issues. They were coming down from churches as well. There were a lot of folks in these communities that belonged to churches that were saying that churches were working on these ideas, in particular the Catholic Church in Nicaragua. And the impact of gender-sensitive and gender-responsive approaches to development projects and interventions has created women who have more knowledge. And those women do use that knowledge to a certain extent in this decision making. And sometimes their husbands even said, well, hey, my wife has this knowledge. I asked her about when to plant the coffee because she went to this training and she knows about that. So we do know that knowledge can help. So when we talk gender sensitive and gender responsive, gender sensitive is just basically getting more women in there and being sensitive to the fact that making sure your audience has some sort of gender balance to it, or men-female balance. And gender responsive is when we look at what women don't have and we create interventions to help them to attain those things. And then the possibilities going forward, are integrating masculine and feminist discourses into trainings and workshops on agricultural practices and climate change, so that men and women can be exposed to different ideas more. And we can do that by involving more women, but also giving them, sort of preparing them to go into these spaces so that they can feel that they can contribute, because a lot of times women go in and they're very quiet and men do all the talking, and that goes back to gender norms. And finally, continuing to work on women's increased access to resources. And like I said, just highlighting, driving it home again, knowledge, and also other types of inputs. So thank you very much. That's the end. Being a woman, I think in Bolivia, using indigenous practices against climate change to strengthen her farm. I am happy to take questions about this study, but also any questions about working in development and what it's like to do these studies, or if you have other questions that that are related, I'm happy to take them. So thank you. Yes.
I'll have a question.
I'm going to